over 50 years now, boys and girls and mums and dads have read and reread Kenneth Grahame's magical story of Mr. Toad and his friends Ratty, Mole and Badger. 4 animals who were sometimes so stupid and sometimes so wise that they were just like human beings. For those who've not yet had the pleasure of their company, and for the thousands who'd like to meet them again, this is the story of The Wind in the Willows. Was it days, weeks, or perhaps even months? The Toad just couldn't remember how long he'd been locked up in the ancient castle. He'd lost all count of time. It was damp and cold in his cell, and the Toad's spirits were at their lowest ebb. He was no longer the reckless creature who disported himself with gay abandon along the English highroads in the sunshine and the fresh air. No longer the popular handsome Toad, the rich and hospitable Toad, the Toad so free and careless and debonair. He was indeed a sad creature, and he flung himself upon the floor sobbing. "Stupid animal that I was," he cried. "For my sins, I must now languish in this dungeon till people who were proud to say they knew me have forgotten the very name of Toad. Oh, wise old Badger! Oh, clever, intelligent Rat and sensible Mole! Oh, what a sound knowledge of men and matters you possess! Oh, unhappy and forsaken Toad!" And so the days and the weeks passed, with Toad in this unhappy state. He refused his meals, he spoke not a word to his jailers, and his condition grew worse and worse. Now the head jailer had a daughter, a pleasant wench and good-hearted, who assisted her father in the lighter duties of his post, and she was particularly fond of animals. This kind-hearted girl, pitying the misery of the Toad, spoke to her father of his plight and asked that she might manage him, feed him up, and altogether make his life more agreeable. And her father, who was tired of Toad and his sulks and airs, was really quite relieved that his daughter should want to look after such an unpleasant prisoner. So one day she went to Toad's cell on her errand of mercy, with a special meal she'd cooked for him. It was bubble and squeak, hot from the oven, and its fragrance filled the narrow cell. But the Toad, lying prostrate on the floor, ignored her. He made no movement, no sound. He lay as in a trance. But being a thoughtful girl, and knowing the ways of animals, the jailer's daughter departed from the cell, leaving the food just in front of the Toad's nose, in the hope that its delightful aroma might arouse him from his stupor. The penetrating smell of the cabbage assailed Toad's nostrils. It was the first time inside this awful prison that a hot meal had been placed before him, and it was the first time that he'd been honored by a visit from the jailer's daughter. And he realized that for one reason or another, he was getting some special attention. And quite frankly, he was rather flattered. He quietly got to his feet, tiptoed to the door, and peered through the narrow barred window. When he was quite sure that no one was around and likely to look in on him, he rushed back to the food and bolted it down with relish. Ah, how delicious it was! It brought new life back to him, and he reflected that perhaps things were not as blank and desperate as he'd imagined. New and inspiring thoughts came to him of chivalry and poetry and deeds still to be done, of broad meadows and cattle browsing in them, and the air of the narrow cell took on a rosy tinge. He thought of his friends and how they might be able to help him, and then of lawyers and how they would have enjoyed his case, and what an ass he'd been not to get in a few. And lastly, he thought of his own great cleverness and resource, and all that he was capable of, if only he gave his mind to it. And the cure was complete. He was Mr. Toad once more. When the girl returned some hours later, she carried a tray with a cup of steaming tea on it, and a plate piled up with hot buttered toast, with the butter running off it, great golden drops like honey from a honeycomb. The toad no longer ignored her. He sat up when she entered, and he munched his toast and sipped his tea, and soon began talking freely about himself and his house, and how important he was, and what a lot his friends thought of him. He spoke of the fish pond and the old walled garden, the pigsties and the stables and the pigeon house, of the dairy, the hen house and the wash house, of the china cupboards and the linen presses. The jailer's daughter liked that bit especially. And as he talked, he munched more toast and he sipped more tea. And it was just as if he were back at Toad Hall, entertaining a gracious lady. He mentioned the banqueting hall and the fun they had there when the other animals were gathered around the table, and how he, Toad, would sing songs and tell stories and carry on generally. And oh, what a wonderful life it was to be Toad of Toad Hall. And then, as he paused for breath, he looked around and realized how his own words had carried him away. For he was still a prisoner, still the occupant of this dark, damp cell. And seeing him sadden a little, the jailer's daughter shook up his straw, filled his jug with fresh water, and quietly left the now tired Toad to sleep and to dream. From that time on, they had many interesting talks, and the jailer's daughter began to feel very sorry for Toad. She thought it a great shame that a poor little animal should be locked up in prison for what seemed to her such a trivial offence. So one morning, she entered the Toad's cell, shut the door behind her, and quietly said, "Toad, listen, please, but I have an aunt who's a washerwoman." "Oh, there," said the Toad, graciously and affably. "Oh, never mind, think no more about it. I have several aunts who ought to be washerwomen." "Oh, do be quiet a minute, Toad," said the girl. "You talk too much, that's your trouble." "Now, as I said, I have an aunt who's a washerwoman. She does the washing for all the prisoners in the castle. She takes the washing out Monday morning and brings it back Friday evening. Now, today's Thursday, and what occurs to me is that you're rich, at least you're always telling me so, and she's very poor. A few pounds won't make any difference to you, and it would mean a lot to her. So if you approached her properly, you could come to some arrangement by which she'd let you have her dress and bonnet, and you could escape from the castle as the official washerwoman. You're like in many respects, particularly about the figure." "We are not," said the Toad in a huff. "I have a very elegant figure, for what I am." "So is my aunt," replied the girl, "for what she is." "Oh, but look here," said Toad. "Surely you wouldn't have Mr. Toad of Toad Hall going around the country disguised as a washerwoman?" "Then you can stop here as a toad," said the girl with much spirit. "I suppose you want to go off in a coach and four." Honest Toad was always ready to admit himself in the wrong. "You're a good, kind, clever girl," he said, "and I am indeed proud and stupid. Introduce me to your worthy aunt, if you'll be so kind, and I've no doubt that the excellent lady and I will be able to arrange terms satisfactory to both parties." Next evening, the girl ushered her aunt into Toad's cell, bearing his week's washing pinned up in a towel. And the sight of certain gold sovereigns that Toad had thoughtfully placed on the table completed the matter there and then. In return for his cash, Toad received a cotton print gown, an apron, a shawl, and a rusty black bonnet. The only stipulation the old lady made being that she should be gagged and bound and dumped in a corner. This, she explained, would help her to retain her situation in spite of the suspicious appearance of things. And then the jailer's daughter helped Toad into his disguise. She shook with laughter as she dressed him up as the washerwoman, and found that he was so plump that his jacket and waistcoat had to come off before anything else would fit. At last she tied the strings of the bonnet under his chin and said, "Toad, why, you're the very image of her. So now goodbye and good luck. Go straight down the way you came up, and if anyone says anything to you, which they probably will, remember you're a widow woman, quite alone in the world, with a character to lose." With a quaking heart, But as firm a footstep as he could command, Toad set forth cautiously on what seemed to be a most harebrained and hazardous undertaking. But he was soon agreeably surprised to find how easy everything was made for him, and a little humbled at the thought that he could not claim the credit for this new popularity. The washerwoman's squat figure in its familiar cotton print seemed a passport for every barred door and grim gateway. Even when he hesitated, uncertain as to the right turning to take, he found himself helped out of his difficulty by the warder at the next gate, anxious to be off to his tea and telling him to hurry up. The various remarks to which he was subjected formed his chief danger, for Toad was an animal with a strong sense of his own dignity.
"Hello, sweetheart."
And the remarks, he thought, were mostly poor and clumsy and entirely lacking in humour. However, he kept his temper, and with difficulty suited his replies to his supposed character, and did his best not to overstep the limits of good taste. It seemed hours before he crossed the last courtyard, rejected the pressing invitations from the last guardroom, and dodged the outspread arms of the last warder, pleading with simulated passion for just one farewell embrace. He was now but a few steps from the busy world. He could see ahead the people of the town meeting and talking as they did every evening. But to Toad, it was all new and exciting. It was life again after so many dreary days in his dank, depressing dungeon. He felt he wanted to run, to flee this dreadful castle as fast as he could, and as he did so to shout rude words at the warders. But this he knew he must not do. No, he must remain a washerwoman for some time yet, until it was safe for him to reassume his real identity. And so Toad took that final step that carried him outside the prison walls. The great wooden door shut fast behind him, and he stood still for a moment. He felt the fresh air upon his brow and knew that he was free.